Okay, then, on that note, it looks like we might as well make a start, Sandra. Yeah,
Yep, let's go.
good. Let's go for it then. So, hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session. A full intro to Azure Devops projects in 60 minutes or less, which is a new session exclusive for GroupBy Europe. So, before we get started, we'd like to remind you about the GroupBy code of conduct for today. I'm sure some of you have seen it already, but just a quick reminder, just basically be on your best behavior.
For the next 60 minutes, we'll be doing a full intro into Azure DevOps projects, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be discussing both cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including source control, the boards, the pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And we will be showing how these services look during the session as well. And at the end of this session, you will have a basic understanding of Azure DevOps and how it can be used for data platform deployments.
So, for the benefit of this session, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our managers decide that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family. Therefore, we must present this introduction to the team.
In reality, getting yourself and your team up to speed on these services is a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 60-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process with this introduction. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will become the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they might get information about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work or removing any impediments if they occur.
Well, Sander, before you go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes, shall we? So my name is Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA living in the Netherlands. I work for Waypoint Analytical. I'm a cloud and data center MVP, which means I do a lot of stuff with PowerShell and stuff, and Azure DevOps. I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project, and you can, if you want, follow me on Twitter. I have a blog, and if you have any questions after this session, because I love questions, drop me an email. All the demos you'll see today will be available on my GitHub page. So go to my GitHub page, go to the presentations, and you will find this session with all the demos in there. And now we're going to go to Kevin's bio, which is slightly more complicated than mine.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. And on that note, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you might be able to tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realize why Sander thinks this is complicated. On that note, I have over 23 years experience working in IT. And over that time, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and the health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. Now, I've worked with all versions of SQL Server in one form or another, and I have various certifications, including both the old and the new style MCSC. And more recently, I became a Microsoft certified DevOps engineer expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. And as you can also see on my bio, I've also recently become an MCT. Now, like Sander, I'm also on social media I'm on Twitter at KevChant. My LinkedIn has got a user-friendly URL of Kevin-Chant. I have my own blog, and my email address is available upon request. Now, before we go too deep into Azure DevOps projects, we want to discuss the difference between Azure DevOps Cloud Services and Azure DevOps Server. For those who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application that you install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, now it's being rebranded to look and feel just like Azure DevOps Cloud Services, so it's easier for people to move between one service and another. Personally, Sander, I prefer to use Azure DevOps Server so that we can handle its security better on premises. Plus, it means we get to keep the backend SQL Server databases. And we'll be able to get some reporting capabilities from those databases, which just are not available yet in Azure DevOps Cloud Services. However, the downside to doing that is that we'd have to deploy multiple servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we'd have to constantly maintain and patch those servers. And also, we may have to wait a while for the new features to become available because of the cloud first strategy.
However, we've decided to use the Azure DevOps Cloud Service instead. So we don't have to patch and maintain anything because it's all maintained by Microsoft in the background for us. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
That's true, and we can still secure it in Azure anyway. Besides, whichever we used, we'd still have to consider security and compliance to keep our auditors happy. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this is that if you use Azure DevOps Server, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself, as where if you use the cloud-based service, everything is done behind the scenes for you.
So, on that note, let's flip over and have a look at Azure DevOps itself. And as you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have the icon, which represents your service, which has access to one or more organizations, which you can see on the left-hand side here. Now, an organization can be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it could just be a division of that enterprise. Of course, it can also just be an organization you've created yourself for testing purposes, as you can see here on the screen. Now, providing you have the right permissions, you can actually change some settings at the organization level. So for example, you can actually change the name of your organization. Just be aware if you do that, that can have some implications if you access other things using the URLs. You can also manage your projects at an organizational level, and you can also view if they're public or private projects. You can also do things like view user information, some interesting auditing you can look at. If you want a more in-depth view of what's been happening, you can look at the usage within Azure DevOps. And also in the general section, you can look at which extensions you currently have installed for use within your project. As far as security is concerned, you can set some interesting policies here relating to it. And you can set some global permissions for your entire Azure DevOps organization. Now, an interesting organization setting relating to boards is that you can change the process that each of your projects use. And we'll talk more about processes later in today's session. Now, there's been some interesting default changes recently as far as the repositories within Azure DevOps is concerned. As you may be aware, there is a bit of controversy relating to the origins of the master branch naming convention within Git. With this in mind, Microsoft have now added the functionality to change the default name of repositories for your main branch, as you can see here. And if you set it here, this means that every single new branch, new repository you create will have a main branch. And that applies for any of your projects. Now there are some global pipeline settings you can change as well. There's settings for agent pools, which we'll talk about later as well. Some general settings for all of your pipelines, as well as some settings relating to your deployment pools and your parallel jobs. And finally, you can have a look at the global amount of storage your entire organization is using for artifacts. Now, if I go back up to the organization view, you can actually see that each organization can have one or more projects inside them. And we happen to have one for today's session. So, as you can see on the left-hand side here, here's all the services that Sander was talking about earlier. So you have Azure boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, and artifacts. And again, if you have the permissions, you can change settings at the project level as well. So in the project details section, again, you can change your name, and you can also give your project a nice user-friendly logo. Some of you may recognize the logo that we've decided to use for this particular project. So you can also manage multiple teams within your project as well. So for example, if I click on the default team here, you see I can manage users for this particular team, as well as some interesting settings for them as well. As well as managing the teams, you can also fine-tune permissions for the teams and for other logical groups that you create within Azure DevOps as well. Because sometimes you'll find that within one team, you may need multiple groups for separation of duties. For example, if I have some people who want to create pipelines and another set of people to actually approve the releases. So if I scroll down and click on our default team again, you can see some of the permissions that we can change for the team at a fine level. We can also change our notification settings here for the entire project. And rather interestingly, we could also create service hooks in the third-party applications in the cloud. So if I click on create subscription here, you can see there's a whole host of services I can connect up to, including Jenkins and Microsoft Teams. I can also change dashboard settings. And then from there, I can also change some interesting board settings, which are global for your whole project. So in project configuration is where you tend to create your different areas and iterations for the teams to use. And by iterations, you can think of along the lines of sprints. In fact, I've actually given these different iterations a name of sprint just to reflect that. And here, if I go to team configuration, I can change various team settings. And you can select which team to choose by just clicking the down arrow at the top here. And you can assign the different areas and iterations for the teams to use. For me personally, I think these probably should be the other way around. So you can select which area your team uses first, and then select which iterations they use. But this is the way it's been decided to be done. Just be aware that if you intend to have multiple teams use the same project within Azure DevOps, you probably want to make sure that they have their own area and that none of them are using the default area. And I suggest doing that because otherwise, if you have a team that uses the default area and you have other teams that use sub areas, you can have some interesting side effects when you want to look at metrics for your sprints. Now, moving on from there, you can manage your GitHub connections, as well as various pipeline settings like agent pools, again, settings, retention periods, etc. And again, just like you can at the organization level, you can change some repository settings at the project level as well. And if I click on settings, again, you can change the default branch name, but this will only be at the project level. Again, you can view the storage your artifacts are using. And again, this is just purely for the project level. And then finally, some settings for your test cases as well.
So now you're talking. Remember, there are other things we can configure as well if we dive deeper into these settings. And the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. Anyway, now we've covered the main project settings. Let's cover version control options, which is Azure repos in Azure DevOps.
You mean like source safe?
Well, maybe something a little bit more modern, since Azure repos supports multiple version control systems like TFVC and Git.
Will that only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think if they started to use the version control more and more, they will start to perform better. At my company, we started to put all our scripting into source control, which is used throughout the entire IT department.
Well, always game for performing better, Sander, so please tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems because we want to have a distributed version control system. Git will be the best solution for us. In fact, in Azure Repos right now, Kevin can show you how that looks like.
Okay. Thank you for volunteering me for doing that, Sander.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you go into Azure Repos, basically you can see how a Git repository looks visually within Azure DevOps. And there's also some other features that come as part of the Azure Repos servers as well. So you can view a visualization of your commit history as well. In addition, your push history, if you have some, you can view all your various branches. You can also view any tags that you add as well. And tags are supposed to represent anything significant that happens within your pipeline. Of course, today, the only thing that is significant is GroupBy. And then finally, you can view various pull requests as well. So anyway, talking about branches, Sander, what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
And they are. Well, and there are various branching strategies that we can use. More common versions of that are the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
Well, they are pretty similar, but the major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. With the GitHub workflow, there is no development branch. There are only feature branches, and those get merged into the main branch after it's getting tested and being successful. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do something like pair programming between dev and ops, they can probably get used to it.
Peer programming?
No, pair programming. And this is where two people write code together. And they would literally sit next to each other working on the same code. And I know with the entire COVID situation, that might be a bit difficult. But research has shown it usually takes a bit longer to do. However, it means you end up with more stable code and people learn new coding practices quicker and more efficient.
Would that mean there's a lot of overhead involved though with that practice?
Well, yeah, you would think that, and you will be correct. It takes about 15% overhead. But that overhead is largely compensated with the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And we all know bug fixes take a lot of time because you have to roll back from production. Of course, there are other methods you can use, like code reviews, which is really common with GitHub. And at the end of the day, we just have to experiment to see what works best for us.
Okay, so I know this is a fairly popular question by quite a few people. So what's to stop somebody coding their own release and just pushing it straight to the main branch?
So I'm glad you asked that. So it looks like Azure DevOps has branching policies. You you can use. So one of which is that 2 people have to approve the updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good, because I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. In fact, if I go back into Azure repos at the moment, I think I remember you showing me this earlier, Sander, if I'm correct. So if I go to the back to branches again and click on the ellipsis, I can scroll down and select branch policies. Now, if you're working with financial data, you may have to be SOX compliant or maybe some other kind of compliancy. In order to be SOX compliant, you have to change your minimum number of reviewers to be at least 2 to have the 4A principle in place. In addition to that, what they also recommend is that you have automatic reviewers. So if I click on the plus sign here, you can see I can actually add yourself or anybody else. And what happens then is every time I go to create a pull request, you will get an email saying that I want to have a pull request done. And we start the conversation from there, yeah?
Yep. And these are the main points we want you to take away from this section of Azure repos. So Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. However, Git has become de facto standard nowadays. In addition, you can use Azure DevOps to secure your updates using branch policies, as you've seen Kevin just demonstrate. And Git really hooks in nicely with other tools from Microsoft like VS Code and Azure Data Studio. So if you had to choose any version control system at this point, go for Git.
Yeah. And talking about Azure Data Studio, again, because I understand it was talking about a conversation earlier as well. You can also now manage your projects within Azure Data Studio by using an extension which is called SQL Database Projects. So now if I go to select the right section to make sure I get Explorer, this is how, and I will zoom in a bit for everybody here. This is how your database project can look now in Azure Data Studio. So in theory, if you use Azure Data Studio now, you can make changes on your database project here, save your changes, commit it to your local Git repository, and then you can sync it up to your Git repository in Azure DevOps. Bit of a quick tip for you all as well, if you are looking to do this. Then one thing I highly recommend you do, if you do import a project based on an Azure SQL database, you may need to change this line here, which represents database schema provider, because I have noticed at times that by default, even if it comes from Azure SQL database, it can default to SQL Server 2016 instead. So a handy thing to bear in mind. Anyway, now we've covered Git. Are there any questions so far relating to anything, Kendra?
I haven't seen any so far, but maybe folks will ask some in the Q&A box.
Let's give them a couple seconds. Maybe you have a couple questions.
Okay, so moving forward, then Sander, I'm guessing that we better discuss Azure Boards since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items.
Okay.
Now,
go ahead.
Thank you. Now, Azure Boards can use basic, Agile, Scrum, or CMMI templates for each project you create in Azure DevOps. And as I mentioned earlier, these templates are also called a process. So that goes back to the process settings I showed you earlier in the organization settings. Because we're using Scrum, Sander, we'll probably want to use the Scrum process. For now, we can keep it as standard, but we can customize these processes if we need to. And since I'm talking about Azure Boards, I might as well quickly give an overview of all the features in there. So in Azure Boards, you have work items, and this basically allows you to view all of your work items in a linear format, as you can see here. As I may have given away just now, there is one really useful piece of functionality that I use within work items, and that is to view any removed items. So if you think somebody's accidentally removed something like a backlog item, you can easily go here and filter the look. Now, in addition to that, in Azure Boards, you actually have a boards feature. And this may seem very familiar to some of you who have worked with Kanban or Scrumban in the past. And it's a very similar format as other board-related applications. And if I click on the settings icon here, just like those other applications, you can change various things as well. For example, you can change the color of the work items based on what tags they have. And of course, columns and swim lanes that are included. Moving on from there, you have a backlogs view, and this basically allows you to view all of your backlog items in a linear format. And this can be at various levels, depending on which process you use. Now, as you can see, this just lists all of your outstanding work. Moving on from there, you actually have a sprint board as well. And this you can use to view everything you're working on in your current sprint. And as you can see at the moment, there's actually a couple of outstanding tasks for one of the backlog items, which we actually need to be marked as done. And we can do this fairly easily just by dragging and dropping them, just like you can do in other board applications. And then finally, there's queries as well. And we will cover queries a bit more shortly.
So, Kevin,
Yep.
how are those backlog items organized for Scrum?
I've just gone back to that screen. I have to flip back again for everyone. So in Scrum, you have a hierarchy of having one or more epics, followed by, and each epic can have one or more features, and each feature can have one or more backlog items. And when you're working during the sprint, you can allocate one or more tasks to those particular backlog items. Now, if you're using Agile, the hierarchy would be slightly different because you'd actually have user stories instead of backlog items.
So how do you propose we use the boards? I mean, if you just have all the backlog items in one big list, it's going to be pretty cluttered, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean there. And that's why I propose we start giving backlog items sensible tags that we can filter on.
So how will we know when an item is ready to go into a sprint?
Well, going back to what I just mentioned about the tags, we could tag the items as being refined once it's met all the criteria. Another option is that we can set the backlog item to be in the approved state, so it's either or. By the way, everybody, on a side note, the standard criteria for an item to be classed as refined in Scrum is size clear and small enough to be done within a sprint. However, businesses can also have their own criteria for when an item is refined and ready for a sprint as well. So bear that in mind.
That sounds good, but hang on a minute though. I've seen that we have various filters on the backlog board, but you can't show items that don't have a certain tag. How will we know what items are left to be refined?
Let's see what you're talking about. Oh, I see. So basically what you're saying is here that there's an or and an and check option, but not a not. Just use a double negative there. Well, we have a few options. However, I think the best option for us to use is beautiful queries. Of course, they're just not called beautiful queries. It's just a nickname that we gave them. So if we actually go here into the queries feature, you can see there's one I've already created earlier. If I click on there, you'll be able to see a backlog item that's not got the refined tag. Now, just for the benefit of everybody who hasn't seen this particular view before, if I click on editor, you can see a query design editor, which probably looks very familiar to those of you who've used other query design editors in the past. In addition to this as well, for those of you who like working with good old-fashioned code, you can actually install an extension called a WIQL editor. That's WIQL. And what this allows you to do is directly edit the query language used for Azure queries. I actually really like using this editor because it gives me a bit more flexibility. And of course, having worked with SQL Server for quite a long time, I'm quite used to this style of syntax as well. So that is the option I think we should go for. Anyway, going back to your initial query about this, Sandra, just so you know, a British guy who's living abroad actually did request from Microsoft to have the not option here. However, because it wasn't very popular, they decided not to go ahead with it, which I can fully understand.
Okay. So this is going to be the part where we're going to meet, that we must set some realistic expectations, right?
Yeah, you're right there. For a start, if the members of our team are new to Azure DevOps, we're going to have to help them get up to speed to make sure our team gets as much out of using Azure DevOps as possible. So we do recommend to all of you to help your colleagues learn more about it. This applies even more to teams like ours, Sander, where we're looking to merge development and an operational team. Because a lot of the time, the teams will have used different frameworks, like ours, for example, Kanban and Scrum. In some cases, though, an operations team may even have only ever used a help desk solution instead of a framework. So to be realistic here, it's going to take a bit of effort to do. And it's probably going to take a bit of time to get the teams used to the other team's way of working.
On that note, I'm guessing we're still going to use our other application to manage the boards in the meantime until we get a good look at this.
It depends. If the company we work for is okay for us to keep using it, then that's fine. However, I've not heard from our manager yet, but if they have decided in the big main meeting that they're going to go all in with Azure DevOps, we can probably still use the other application for a while whilst we still get used to Azure boards. However, personally, I recommend that we rip the Band-Aid off as soon as possible and start using Azure boards as soon as we can to take advantage of all the integration Azure boards has with everything else within Azure DevOps. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and previews features we can potentially use within Azure boards?
Steady on. We only have 60 minutes. We can do an entire different session altogether with that.
That's true. And if we did do that session, people will have to watch it elsewhere. Anyway, the main thing to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
Okay, now it's time to talk about Azure Pipelines, which is where we're going to build and deploy our deliverables.
Okay, how would this work with SQL Server?
Well, we could look to deploy using state-based or migration-based deployments.
Well, what's the main difference between those two?
Well, with state-based, you deploy the entire project in its entirety. So, and check for changes. Whereas migration-based, you script out all the changes that happened the last time and create new files and scripts for those. And you implement those incrementally instead. And migration-based can be good, but if there is a problem, we'd have to redeploy all over again. So for what we intend to do, I think state-based is better for us. And it's easy to get your databases in source control and get those pipelines going, as I will demonstrate right now.
You're going to steal the screen, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm going to steal the screen from you. Yes, I am. So when I first had to get our databases into source control, I was creating those projects mainly in Visual Studio, adding all different projects because I wanted to separate the data model from my unit tests. And that was a lot of work because we have over 30 databases and I didn't want to do that manually. So what I did was I created a small little template using the PS framework, or more exactly the PS module development PowerShell module. And that module enables me to create a template for files, but also complete directory structures, which is an SSDT solution, which is a complete directory structure. And with some tweaking, I was able to create a template out of that, which is available on my GitHub page, by the way, which is recently updated to the latest version with T-SQL. And if I run that little script, then the most important part of that is all the way down, because the rest of that script will download the template and install it for you. It's this little piece of code. And the only thing it wants is a template name, the output path, and a project name. So if I run that little script, it's going to download that from my GitHub page. It's going to download that latest version. Takes a couple seconds. There we go. Take a sip of water in the meantime. And we're done. So this script also opens that same directory. So if I open that, it's going to open Visual Studio. While that's doing it, I am going to create a sample database. So this is my SSDT solution. And as you can see, I have two projects in here. One is the unit testing data. Unit testing is the name of my database. So I've got one for the data model and one for the tests. And let's see if it already finished creating those tables. Wow, that's slow. So why did I separate the projects? Because if I want to do any deployments using either one, if I only want to do the data model deployments with the deck pack, I don't want to include any of my tests into production. So if I separate these into different projects, I can create multiple deck packs that do different things for me. So it's almost done. There we are. So now if I have my database, I can say import. So right click my data model. I say import database. I'm going to select a connection. And this time I am going to create a new connection. No, that's not going to work. Of course, that's not going to work. Browse. I'm going to put that in. Of course, I recently changed everything on my there we go. I'm really bad at typing passwords. Yep. There we go. Now, if I say refresh, there we go. And I want to have only the object type. Say start. And now it's going to import all my objects into my SSDT solution. There we are. So now I have my stored procedures in here and my tables, and I can do a deployment. from here. So if I double click my publish profile, it will say, hey, where do you want to deploy this to? Back to you, Kevin.
Ah, okay. Well, in that case, just hope I go back to sharing the right screen here. And lucky it will do, because I've noticed they made a nice change in the theme since the last time I used it.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Sander's repo creation that he just showed you there, his project creation, I should say, actually ends up looking like you see on the screen here. This actually came from what Sander was just demoing just now. Now, Sander, I have to ask about unit tests, because even though you did mention it briefly just now, I was drinking my very British style pint of water. So what about unit tests? Because I know we can do it for other programming languages within Azure DevOps.
So I can show you how that works, because I'm going to share my screen again. So like I said, I have different projects within my solution. And I mentioned before that I am lazy as hell when it comes to repetitive tasks. So what I did was I created a PowerShell module called PST_SQL test generator. And what this will do is it will create all the T-SQL unit tests for you based on the current state of your database. So it points to a database, gets all the objects like the tables, subprocedures, functions, views, everything, and then creates tests for them, like the existence of objects, does the table have the correct columns, correct data types, all those kind of things. So if I run that, it's going to point me to my database. And that module is freely available on the PowerShell gallery. This is the name. And the only thing you have to run is this little command. And in this case, my destination is my just created SSDT solution. So it's going to output that right into my test basic folder. I'm going to show you later on how that looks like. So it's going through all the different objects. As you can see, it creates a test for the table existence. I'm not sure why it's saying something like login field. Still creating all the tests. Come on. Almost done. Are we done? Be a good boy. There we are. So now I have all my tests in here. I only have to import them. And if I do something like this, say, okay, I want the existing item, select everything, add. Now I have all my unit tests in my project. And one really important test, for example, is the collation. I don't want our developers to do anything with different collations, because that's going to generate a heap of trouble. And if I do anything with a deployment, I can just say double click my publish profile, say okay, edit. This is not going to be that. So of course I'm not typing correctly. I'm going to call it unit testing tests. Say publish. It's going to build my entire DAC pack. There we are, executing the publish script. And now it's done. So if I go to Azure Data Studio and I do a refresh, I have my database. I could do a new query and do something like tsql dot run all. And here we are. So these are all my unit tests I just created in a couple minutes, and everything is successful. So you don't have, you'll have your basic unit tests in there within a matter of minutes, and there's no, it at least helps you to get started. Don't do this for the entire database every time, because it will take the current state of your database and all the tests will be successful. So
Yeah.
That was unit testing in a nutshell.
That's good. Well, I've just gone back to see how your final project looks in Azure DevOps, and I'm just going to take the screen again.
Oh,
yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure we've got 14 odd minutes left, and we need to
hurry up,
get this show going. So back to the screen again. So I noticed whilst experimenting whilst you were doing your tsql demo that we can either use the classic editor or YAML for our pipelines, and your script creates the YAML. So which should we use?
Well, the classic editor is good for getting to know the different options, but I think in the end, YAML is going to be better because got way more options, and that's where your pipelines are going to go anyway.
Yeah, because if I remember correctly as well, the YAML pipelines are basically allow you to do your build and release all entirely within that single pipeline, as opposed to how it used to be in Azure DevOps until a while back, when you used to have to manage your builds and releases separately. In fact, Sander, whilst you were doing your tsql demo, it was taking a while. I actually made some small adjustments to the YAML code that your tool actually created, and I actually added a few extra stages. So as you can see here, I actually installed a few different containers locally on my laptop to represent integration, staging, and production environments. And basically from your initial database project, I went off to create a DAP pack and deployed it to all three of those SQL 2019 Docker containers I have. And if you look here, for example, and go back, and I actually click on the right one here, you can actually see how they look. So here's one that represents an integration environment, one to represent staging, where you tend to do your user acceptance tests, and then of course your production environment. And then I thought I would have a bit of a quick dabble whilst you were doing your thing, and I actually went off and made a few extra stages as well. So I've got it syncing with a GitHub repository as well. So if you want to, we can have a GitHub action run as well from the same database project you've been working on. And in addition to that, as you can see here as well, I actually managed to get it sorted out to create a completely different DAP pack to deploy to an Azure SQL database. So I can actually quickly show now how that works if I just quickly do this. So very quick upshot, because we have 11 minutes left. What I did is created a stage which essentially declares variables and then goes off to copy files to a secure state folder within your staging area. And then from there, the exact copy of your repository that you create, you could actually run a piece of PowerShell just to rename that STP line to reflect which version of SQL Server you want the new DAP pack to be deployed to. Once that line of SQL is changed, you can essentially build your project based on that renamed STP setting. So basically create a DAP pack for another version of SQL Server and publish it as an artifact, which is a deliverable basically within Azure DevOps. And from there, you can just go to do a deployment. And to show how that looks here, here's actually a database that was already installed. I would go into a lot more detail here, but however, for the benefit of time, I thought I would speed this up a bit. Now, as I said, you can also sync this with GitHub Actions as well. Anyway, over to you, Sander.
So, of course, there are other ways we can do the SQL deployments as well. So, like using PowerShell instead from your YAML to handle deployments if we're dealing with a large number of servers.
Okay, very curious to know this, mate. How will you know if this worked?
Well, we could get PowerShell to output the XML in the same format as the JUnit test results, and then allow Azure DevOps to use the XML in the task, which publishes the test results, to view the results visually. Of course, we can put other feedback mechanisms in place for deployments as well.
We can do that?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So if we go back to edit the pipeline, are we limited to those tasks we saw on the screen earlier?
Nope. In fact, you can install loads of additional extensions from the marketplace. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we'd have to request to install those instead and not be able to install them straight away, which you usually do, whichever team manager to Azure DevOps organization.
I didn't realize that was a thing.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. So it does mean we can get help with those security and compliance issues you were talking about earlier.
I see. And of course, if we just quickly go back to Azure pipelines, you can see there are other features a part of it as well, like environments, which you use for control various things in your pipeline releases. Release, which is, like I said, the classic release environment, and then there's library for your variables. Task groups, so you can collectively group a load of tasks together to reuse in multiple pipelines, and deployment groups where you can just logically group together various servers that have an agent installed on each one. Anyway, I've seen that we can use Microsoft hosted agents even within our own network on premises. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure, we'd have a lot of issues internally, like we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests. So maybe we're better off building our own agents internally.
Maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't want to build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out what software to install on those agents and maintain them, etc., etc., etc. What are you doing, Kevin? Oh, yeah. That looks promising.
So basically, as you can all see here, Microsoft provides guidelines on how you can create your own agents internally.
Nice. Well, if we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line itself using it as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows when running things through the command line, you get more detailed results, right?
Well, I tested this earlier, so let's see what happens, eh?
So, and not much there. So, next part, test plans.
Hey, you kind of wanted to move on fairly quickly there, didn't you?
Yeah, it doesn't show much. So,
right. So here's a feature in Azure DevOps is often overlooked by people who work with the Microsoft Data Platform, and that's that you can create very powerful test plans. And usually we would go a bit more in depth about this. However, like we said, this is a 60-minute session. So I'll quickly show you here how it looks. So if I click here, I can actually run this as a web application. So as you can see here, basically we can have a checklist in place to do a lot of manual testing for various test plans. In these, we can also put in nice pictures to show what to test as part of our deployments. Plus, we can take screenshots and we can record ourselves. And plus, rather interestingly, we can record ourselves with audio if needs be. And if there's a problem, we can create a bug straight in our Azure Devops. You can actually install an application called Test Runner locally instead of using the web application. However, there are some flaws with doing that. So I kind of recommend to stick using the web-based one if possible.
Great. So we are running out of time, so we better discuss artifacts here, which is where we can share various things like NuGet packages with other people. For example, if I create a NuGet package, I can share it in Azure Artifacts for others to use.
Yeah, so I will just quickly, for the benefit of time, demo what Artifacts looks like now. So you can think of Artifact similar conceptually a bit like a Linux repository. It's basically a storage area for various packages. And you do this by creating various feeds, as you can see here. Now, before we finally finish talking about projects today, we also just want to cover one more thing as well. And it's just to remind all of you that you are eligible to create your own Azure DevOps organization to test things on. And if you have a Visual Studio subscription, it can bring you additional benefits as well.
Just in case that you want to test things without the fear of breaking your company's Azure DevOps organization.
Now, to be honest, Sander, there's other things I'm looking forward to the team using as well. And I think we want to quickly show those to everybody as well right now. For example, the various dashboards that we can configure. And if you remember, I did say there's some interesting dashboard settings earlier. And because you're going to be the Scrum Master, I'm sure you're going to want to show off this dashboard at the start of the daily stand-up every day. And you're going to want to remind the entire team what the sprint goal actually is. And from here, you can also view our velocity and our sprint burn down as well as the sprint progresses. Another thing I just want to quickly show everybody is analytics views, and basically all of these different views within Azure DevOps, based on metrics from Azure boards, you can actually use as data sets for Power BI. And I've used this myself to reproduce a sprint review, and it's really, really good.
Cool. Don't forget the wiki.
That's true. Also, there is actually an Azure DevOps extension for CLI as well, which is really very good, especially for command line lovers. So back over to you, Sander.
So that looks like a great way to manage a project for command line lovers. Exactly. But like we said earlier, this will take a bit of work. So where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest that we start by getting the teams together again after this basic introduction and explain to them what we're trying to achieve.
Good idea. So we should get everybody on board if you want them to use Azure DevOps fully. Anyway, that's all we have time for today. And I see we have one question. I think that's a good question for you, Kevin.
There is a question, and it is about reporting on the progress of all the project items, epic features, and possibly user stories. Is there a way they can use Azure DevOps to provide, it sounds like, high-level project status reports for top-level management? Not sure if you do that with a dashboard or if you do that with something else.
You would actually do it with something else. And we touched earlier about the fact we can literally talk for an entire session about Azure boards, and we already have done in the past. let me go back into this quickly now. We have got some time, obviously, for questions because the session was 60 minutes long. So you want to report on all of Epic's features, user stories, etc. So for top level management, you would actually install an extension which will allow you to use something called portfolio plans. And if I quickly go back to Sander's organization here in another tab, I will actually be able to tell you which extension it's called, because it's got a very different name. So feature timeline and Epic roadmap is the extension you want to look to install. And once you install that, you be able to use what's called a portfolio plan. And this is basically where you can create a portfolio view for upper management and project managers. I hope this answers your question, because you can drill down into this and it's really powerful.
Nice. That's awesome. All right. If other folks have questions after the session, if they realize later they have a session, do you have a preferred way that they might be able to ask you? Do you like Twitter? Do you like email? Do you like handwritten letters?
Handwritten letters, not so much. I'm just flicking through quickly to our bios, so you can obviously reach out to either of us on social media. As you can see here, Sander's details here again, and obviously my social media details are here as well. You can give either of us a shout. Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever medium people are comfortable with, because I do understand some people don't like using some of the social media platforms.
Yeah, and I sometimes after a session realize I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, why didn't I ask this? So that may well happen.
Yes.
I actually had a question. If we still have a couple minutes, I think the next speaker doesn't come on for a little bit. So I had more than one question. One is, so do you still use the releases pipelines, the classic releases pipeline? Are there cases where you might still use those, or have you just entirely switched over to doing everything in a combined build and release pipeline?
We are, for my particular client I have at the moment, we've moved the majority of our things over from the classic editor to the CI/CD pipelines, and the other ones are outstanding. We're going to be moving very, very soon. Basically, we're going all in with CI/CD pipelines. It's personally, I think that's the direction that everybody should be going now, because the CI. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Why so? What are the major benefits of doing that? I guess is a good question.
Well, it's as you may have seen earlier, it's very flexible. And it also allows you to do both your builds and releases within one central pipeline environment. It gets people used as well. And even though this is an Azure DevOps session, again, another bit of a reality check, you may find over the years that you will have to look to use other deployment mechanisms. And if you start using YAML now for Azure DevOps, it will be a healthy habit to get into. If you want to look, for instance, at GitHub Actions, which is solidly based on YAML.
So this is another, I would love to hear your take on this. I've actually been asked this question multiple times. Some folks have said, do you think that GitHub Actions are going to replace the automation in Azure DevOps? Like, I don't have any secret knowledge on this, but this question just gets, so I'm just curious if you have not secret knowledge, but like what your take on that is. Should people learn GitHub Actions because it's the future, or is it still kind of maybe?
Yeah, I have the feeling that Microsoft is going to go with GitHub Actions in the future and kind of slowly goes away from the pipelines. Maybe they're going to integrate it in Azure DevOps more in a better way, but because Microsoft bought GitHub, I have a feeling they're going to leverage GitHub Actions more and more. And I also think the development goes faster for GitHub Actions than pipelines.
Okay.
We actually get asked this a lot, all the time. And the reality is, obviously, like yourself, we don't have any insights either. but usually we do answer by saying that you may realize that all of Microsoft's code and documentation is stored in GitHub. So that's one observation people might want to keep in mind.
And
we've
and even if
go
we
ahead.
had the knowledge, we were not allowed to tell it anyway.
Right, exactly. Like if I had any secret knowledge, I'd have to be like, I've heard there's this question. I actually don't have an answer to it.
And by the way, the template I showed you has a both a GitHub workflow for the GitHub Actions and one for the Azure pipelines. So if you generate that your SSDT solution with that template, you will have the ability to either use GitHub Actions or the Azure Devops pipelines right from the start.
We have a comment from Richard. GitLab, I think it's GitLab. CI have been doing CI pipelines a lot longer since GitHub Actions.
Yeah.
And then I see that you answered the question about what the R in Kevin R. Chant means. I don't think that was an attempted identity theft, but you never know.
Well, you know, Chris is a bit of a, you never know with Chris, eh?
Yeah. Oh,
but
I
yeah.
have another question for Sander. For your T-SQL-T auto generation thing, I didn't notice a license file in the repo. Do you have a license that you've set on your auto generator?
Isn't there a license file there?
I didn't notice. It might be not just at the highest level. I was trying to watch the presentation. I just looked at the highest level of the repo.
It's MIT license, so you can
okay.
use it or do anything what you want with it. So
great.
It's open source, and if anybody has anything to add or finds anything that doesn't work, let me know.
Cool. If folks haven't seen, there is a new build out of T-SQL-T itself recently in the last couple of weeks for the first time in a few years. So very exciting to see T-SQL-T itself up and running, as well as complementary tooling that works with it. I love that.
I think Sander has already taken that into consideration, haven't you, Sander?
Yeah, that template already uses the latest version of T-SQL-T. So
I think
you are on it. It has been like
I think within 12 hours of it coming out, Sander had the update done.
Hey, you have to keep up to date. So
Richard comments that Redgate test is based on T-SQL-T. That is true.
Yeah.
I actually work for Redgate, and we are not quite as fast as Sander. I don't know that we've published an update yet, but we are kind of spreading the news around and working to get on the newer version now that it's out.
It has some good improvements for the later versions of SQL Server. So installation is way easier, and the handling of CLR.
It has been a roller coaster with the CLR with T-SQL-T, in part because whether or not CLR actually works in Azure SQL database has changed multiple times. It's not T-SQL-T's fault necessarily. Do you know if T-SQL-T now supports synonyms better? I don't know if there's actually been improvements in the synonym area in T-SQL-T or not.
Not as far as I've seen. No.
So Sebastian, how do you say Sebastian's last name? Is it Meine? Am I getting it right?
Yeah, Meine. I think it's German. Meine.
Quite possibly. If Daniel's here, he might actually have an opinion on this. Daniel may not be back, but I'll pop Sebastian's Twitter handle in there if you want to follow up with him he will have much more detailed knowledge on the synonyms issue than I will perhaps ever have.
And if it needs to support the synonyms better, the